I did think of myself as a businessman, but let's be honest, that was me just justifying my bullshit, my hustle, trying to fucking get around my conscience, so to speak. We put stuff on the block that people OD'd from, man. So you gotta try to rationalize that shit in your mind, man, you know what I mean? It's hard not to have regrets, of course. But a lot of my regrets ain't just because I'm sentenced to 109 years to life. It's just that neither one of their deaths was my intention to kill them.
I think we could all be dangerous people.
People say you're a monster.
I'm not sitting here saying I'm innocent.
I just murdered somebody in cold blood.
The 1980s and 1990s, it was a dangerous time in New York City. The city was kind of reeling from a crack epidemic, tormented by drugs, crime. It was a land of lawlessness. The drug gangs were leaving a swath of violence, not just through the housing projects, but even the streets of New York. They were merciless. They had no regard for human life. Take a guy like Kevin Saxon. His story stood out.
There used to be pride in the fact that I was making money quickly in the streets. For me to say and tell you I still got pride in that now, it's just ludicrous. Somebody lost their life on the other end of that, man. And that's people that I care about, you know what I mean? I was born in Harlem, May 1970. I lived in Abraham Lincoln Projects, known as Lincoln Projects, to some stinking Lincoln. Very notorious projects. In Lincoln, it breeded, to be honest, future criminals. People sold drugs on the corners of Lincoln. People that lived in Lincoln committed robberies, stuff like that. Living there molded me though. Made me tough. My earliest childhood memories ain't good. My mother was an alcoholic. She had 6 kids, she didn't take care of none of us. It was difficult, very difficult. There'd be times I'd be riding my bike in the park and she's laid out on the bench, pissy drunk. My mother turned me over to my grandparents and they had a hold of me until I was like 6 or 7 before my father came and got me from my grandmother and convinced her that he was the best option to raise me. Why, I don't know. My father also was an alcoholic and addicted to other substances. He was violent. Beat me with hangers, extension cords, Um, it was hell on earth for me for those couple of years. I remember going to my father and telling him that I got jumped by a couple of older kids in the block. And he smacked me around, took me back to the park, made me fight all three of them. And then after it was over, he beat me up some more. And he told me, you fight. You don't run from nobody. And I was fighting ever since. I did robberies. I stuck up supermarkets. I stuck up people. None of it I'm proud of. None of it. I learned early on that I had a nice left hand. I knock you out with it. And it became my signature, and I used it anytime I had to. But this is the environment and the culture in which I was brought up in. And we was taught this is how you survive. So I just went with what I knew. I started feeling like, okay, this probably is a better hustle for me than robbing people. You know, $400 or $500 a week. You know, now that sounds like chicken scratch, but you're talking about a kid. It wasn't no dreams of wanting to, you know, be some big time drug dealer at that time. It was my way of just getting stuff that I wasn't gonna have otherwise. That's what it was about for me. And I became pretty good at it. It was a bigger operation than what I ever worked for before. And within this whole building, everything was sold. Crack, dust, cocaine. I was immediately thrust into like a lieutenant position. So you're right underneath the person that runs it. You're basically his eyes and ears. I controlled the building. It was my job to protect the building and the spots and the people that worked in it. You have to be feared, but you also have to be smart. You can't go around just shooting everybody and stabbing everybody. But when it's time to make a statement, it's okay to do that too. I was not convicted for it. The one witness that they did have was an addict who owed me a couple of dollars and decided that that was the way not to pay me, so he went to them and made up some story. I beat several lineups, but they locked me up on it anyway and made me actually lay up on Rikers Island for a nice little time. Rikers Island in the 80s and 90s was a brutal place, man. Stabbings, sexual assault, extortion, cuttings. Yeah, Rikers Island was definitely a whole nother animal. There was no Bloods and Crips, those sort of gangs on Rikers Island then. It was more about where you from. Borough wars, so to speak. Terrence Smith was what we called each other, comrade. We're similar in age, similar interests, and we decided that we just wasn't gonna be anybody's victim on Rikers Island, that we were not gonna be extorted, we wasn't gonna be punked and all this, so it bonded us. He was from Brooklyn, but he was my friend. However, somebody from Chilo's hood said that he overheard me plotting against him. And it just wasn't true. This individual used this situation to try to get rid of me, but I just thought that it was gonna work itself out. He thought I betrayed him. And we went at it. I got cut. And he died. Wasn't my intention. I don't want to get into details about, I stabbed him here, there. It just shouldn't happen. He was my boy. He died over a lie. It's no excuse, it's just a fact. I was taught to fight. So I fought. I was taught to protect myself. I did. I didn't feel that I had a choice at that point.
Oh, wow, okay.
Yes.
That's nice.
You should take it home so you can use it.
Lincoln House has came a long way. About 20 years ago, this place was a dangerous place to be.
Crime was wild and the drugs were flowing.
Kevin Saxon's name is still very known. He meant different things to different people. Fear, for some. security and safety for others. Maybe his methods were not correct, but you don't get to choose what your ecosystem looks like. Kevin Saxon is a product of his environment. When you're born in a place like Lincoln, you're born into poverty. In an impoverished community, some things are chosen for you, and it makes you make choices. If you see that the drug dealer has the most respect and the most money and the best things, then you want to be a drug dealer. What do you expect?
Some people would say, yeah, drug dealing is bad, but some people didn't have anything. It was their only way out. Kevin wasn't trying to be this big, great name or anything like that. He was trying to provide. My name is Ella. I'm Kevin's ex-wife. We grew up in Lincoln together. Kevin and I and a group of other friends, we used to hang out all the time. Kevin was very genuine, very genuine. If you needed something, he would give it to you. Regardless of what she was going through, he loved his mother. He used to go to the park, see her sleeping on a bench. You know, she's wet herself, so he'd get her up, take her wherever she needed to be taken to. And it didn't matter, that was still his mother. When he started dealing drugs, his thing was, nobody's taking care of me. I need to get some money. And I never questioned that. Whatever he did to get his money, then he did to get his money. I went to visit him one day, and they was like, he's in court. So I get on a payphone and I call his aunt. And she told me, Kevin murdered somebody in the jail. And I was in tears. The thought of Kevin killing someone, that was definitely horrific. The guy that I know is sweet to me. In my mind, somebody had to be doing something to him for that to happen, to that extreme. When he finally told me what happened, there was no judgment. When Kevin came home from prison, we wanted to give our son the best life possible, and that was our main goal. He was focused. You know, I gotta make sure I be a father, a husband, you know, get a job. And I was happy about that. You know, he's a straight and narrow. Everything is good. Everything is good. Working a job, that wasn't easy. He's not used to working a job. But he put in a big effort of doing it.
When I came home in 1999, I had no intentions on getting into the streets. Unfortunately, though, I started finding out that Ella had some struggles. You know, money problems, debt. And I wasn't making enough to get us out of it and then maintain us out of it. Like I remember literally my son coming to me and asking me for $1 to get a water, and I didn't have it. And that kind of just made me say, all right, I gotta do something. And when you feel your back is up against the wall, then you go to what you know. Heroin was the moneymaker at that point. It was a significant amount on a daily basis. I got in saying, okay, I'm gonna make sure that the rent and all that stuff is paid. And it started coming so fast that I didn't know how to get out. I was walking around with $25,000 chains on, $30,000 bracelets. My son, I bought him bikes, I don't know how many clothes. Thinking because my father didn't do it for me, that I was doing the right thing. You know, you addicted to that type of shit. Every time I said, okay, I gotta let it go, I just kept saying, well, how am I gonna continue my lifestyle? So I stayed where I was at.
It's mind-blowing to hear him. He was really struggling to try to be the man that I want him to be the man that he wanted to be the father that he wanted to be. But sometimes it don't happen that way. He said he will never put his child through what he went through, and he didn't. He didn't have another way. He did what he knew how to do, and he knew he was good at it.
Harlem in the 80s, it's like the bottom of the barrel. Everybody scraping and scratching. So crack era was like a relief to everybody. It was like a way to make money. It ain't fun growing old in jail. So I made up my mind I wasn't coming back. Owning the restaurant has been a little dream of mine, something I wanted to do for a while, especially in my old neighborhood too, so that's a plus. Beef, meatloaf, pepper steak, smothered turkey wings. The difference between me and Kevin, well, it's not really a big difference. It's just that I went back to prison for less time than he did. I got basically a second chance. But Kevin had respect in the projects as far as from the children to the grown-ups. We took care of everybody.
In the drug game, there's moral code. There's principles that you have. You don't involve civilians into things unless civilians involve themselves into things. I'm known in the streets now. Sometimes you can be generous. You know, give back a little bit. You know what I mean? You know a guy hard on his luck. You got a pocket full of money, give him some. You look out for people that can't look out for themselves.
The way you carry yourself is how people will look at you. If you carry yourself like a man of honor and like a boss, most people will treat you like that. Kevin had a high set of morals. There's nobody's going to touch a lady or a child around us, especially not around Kevin. If you broke that code, most likely you'll be shunned, you'll be out of the circle. But you have people who don't go by any code. They go by their own set of rules. Richard Gaines is one of those guys. So, yeah, I can understand the choice that Kevin took.
Richard Gaines, AKA Country. Everybody knew Big Country in the penitentiary, man. He did 2 decades in prison, came home at 40 something, and he still was a very imposing figure. Country and I got into a dispute based on the distorted view of what disrespect is. I used to give him money all the time. This particular day, I seen him, buying his crack. So literally all I said to him was, I don't care nothing about that money. But Country's a very powerful man. And the fact that I mentioned that money, with a bunch of people around, he took it as disrespect. He lifted up his shirt, showed me his gun. Called me the B word, like it just went from 0 to 100 real quick. The very next day, I was told that Country said it wasn't over. He said that he knew where I lived. Again, he showed the gun, and I retrieved my own. I just felt, Country, I can't let you just say this. My kid is there, bro. Like, his mom is there. Like, I gotta let you know, you can't do that. He's cutting down from 5th Avenue on 129th Street, going towards Madison Avenue. Nobody out there. There's some distance between us. And I got out on the fire twice. Got back in my truck and I pulled off. Unfortunately, he died, man. I know people can't believe this. I wasn't trying to kill him. I was trying to hurt him. I was trying to let him know, and for everybody that was out there, you're not gonna talk to me like this. I had to do something. Like, I had to show some kind of example.
Kevin Saxon was a notorious drug lord with a ruthless penchant for violence, and he also seemed to have either a broken moral compass or no moral compass whatsoever. One of his crimes that he was accused of when he was 15 years old was punching a 76-year-old man in an elevator, punching him right in the face. He mugged a woman who was 7 months pregnant. He was a very nasty individual. My name is Richard Weir. I've been a longtime newspaper reporter during the 90s and then early 2000s I was embedded in the New York City Police Department, working out of a police bureau. You didn't get to the pinnacle of a drug operation by being nice and being caring and compassionate. You got there by being ruthless, by ruling with an iron fist. And murder was par for the course. This murder of Richard Gaines was what really made this case stand out. According to my police sources, Gaines was a rival drug dealer and was muscling in on Saxon's turf. Saxon tracks him down, puts a bullet in the back of his head, and shoots him. The first time he tried taking Gaines out was on a Sunday in September during the African Day Parade. He opens up on Gaines in a crowded street and misses. And it hits a car, shatters the rear windshield of this woman with 2 little kids in the car. And this just shows you the utter disregard he had for human life, the callousness. Any person that opens fire on a crowded street and puts other people's lives in jeopardy, I don't think has a moral code.
When these drug dealers infiltrate these projects, they're basically destroying a community. Unfortunately, a whole neighborhood suffers the consequences for their choices. But drug dealers don't really care about anybody else. They only care about themselves. My name is Eddie Benitez. I'm a retired detective from the NYPD. I was assigned to the high intensity drug trafficking area task force. Our assignment was basically to go after the violent drug gangs that were operating in the New York City area at the time. Having Kevin Saxon arrested, without a doubt, made the city safer. Anytime you remove drug dealers from a location, you actually see kids playing in the streets again, people hanging out again. There's a sense of satisfaction that he was arrested and put away.
$109 years. I never thought in a million years that I would have that kind of time. I made mistakes. Done a lot of shit I ain't proud of. But how is it that I don't deserve a parole board? I'm gonna die in jail. I'm not sitting here saying I'm innocent. I'm not. I'm not sitting here saying that I shouldn't be held accountable. I should. But to die like this is beyond me, though.
I've never met a guy who was sentenced who didn't complain about his sentence. That's just the way it is. People are going to complain. Kevin Saxon chose the game. If you don't want to end up in jail for a long time, don't deal drugs. Don't kill people. It's very simple, right?
I agree with the judge. The laws are made to protect the normal citizens of society. If you venture out, then you really shouldn't complain about the harsh punishment you get. That's the game that you're in, you know? As a Christian, I always believed that people can be redeemed. But he proved that he wasn't going to go down that road. It's a waste of a human life, but that's what he chose. And now, unfortunately for him, he has to suffer the consequences.
You try to keep hope, but even that is hard. One day you could wake up and everything is okay. And then the next day you could wake up and it's like, fuck, I ain't never getting out of here. But in this situation, make sure we reevaluate. Cause I did something different. I should have did something different. There was better ways. I just was going off of things that I was taught, my experiences, my environment, my immaturity. So yeah, there's regrets.
Gaines was a rival drug dealer and was muscling in on Saxon's turf. The first time he tried taking Gaines out was on a Sunday in September during the African Day Parade. He opens up on Gaines on a crowded street and shatters the rear windshield of this woman with two little kids in the car.
Bullshit. There was no crowd of people on the streets. The African Day Parade was on 7th Avenue. The incident happened on 5th Avenue. I agree wholeheartedly that I was reckless. But this notion that I was reckless with 100 people running up and down the streets and I'm just firing away, it's just not the reality of what actually took place. And it's baffling for somebody to say that Country was another drug dealer. Like what? He was a user. He was smoking crack. He wasn't muscling in on no territory.
When he was dealing, there was no judgment. There was no judgment at all. He didn't have no choice. He didn't have another way.
I just feel bad because I didn't do right by it. But Ella was right. She never judged me, but she never said much neither. I needed somebody that was gonna give me the real. Don't let me push back without them pushing even harder. And Ella just let me do what I wanted to do. I have a lot of regrets for the choices I made that affected not just Ella, my family, my friends, people that love me, and especially my son. Because my son is serving a sentence in prison right now, and I believe that's because of my actions and my way of life, and him being exposed to it, and him mimicking in his own life. But I think that what people fail to realize is I too was a part of the damage. I'm not just a product of Lincoln and the monstrosities that goes on in Lincoln. I was a product of an alcoholic mother, an alcoholic abusive father. I was, in my mind, meeting violence with violence. But doesn't mean that it was right. Bad choices can come from bad environments. So, no excuses, but it's real.
rain started before midnight and never stopped. It hammered against the empty highway outside Cedar Ridge like thousands of tiny fists beating on sheet metal, drowning the town beneath a curtain of static noise that blurred headlights, erased footprints, and swallowed screams whole. At 2:13 in the morning, a truck driver heading south on Route 17 noticed something lying half-submerged in a drainage ditch near the tree line. At first he thought it was a mannequin tossed from a moving vehicle. Then lightning flashed across the sky. A pale arm appeared beneath the water. Human. Motionless. Bent at an impossible angle. By sunrise, police tape wrapped around nearly 50 yards of muddy roadside, patrol lights stained the rain blue and red, and one question spread through Cedar Ridge faster than the storm itself. Who would do something this savage? The victim was 24-year-old Emily Grayson. Waitress. Part-time college student. No criminal record. No known enemies. The kind of woman neighbors described with the same tired phrases used after every tragedy. Quiet. Friendly. Hard-working. But detectives standing over her body that morning weren't thinking about personality traits. They were staring at violence. Extreme violence. Bruises layered over bruises. Defensive wounds on both hands. Mud packed beneath broken fingernails. A deep wound near the collarbone. Signs she fought until the final seconds. Someone had wanted control. Someone had wanted silence. Her car was missing. Her purse gone. One shoe recovered nearly 20 feet away. The other never found. Reporters arrived before the coroner even left the scene. Satellite vans crowded the shoulder of the road. Cameramen filmed the ditch while local anchors spoke in hushed dramatic tones about a young woman found brutally murdered during severe weather conditions. Within hours, Emily's face covered every television screen in the county. A graduation photo. Blonde hair. Bright smile. The image every newsroom uses when trying to remind viewers that horror always looks ordinary before it happens. Police traced Emily's final movements through witness statements gathered across town. She had finished a late shift at Marlowe's Diner just after midnight. Several customers remembered seeing her laughing near the coffee station before locking the front doors. A co-worker claimed Emily mentioned stopping at a gas station on the way home. Another said she seemed distracted all evening, repeatedly checking the front windows whenever headlights passed outside. Detectives pushed harder. Was she scared of someone? Was she meeting someone? Nobody knew. Or nobody admitted knowing. At the quick fuel station 2 miles from the diner, security cameras captured Emily entering the store at 12:41 a.m. Grainy footage showed her purchasing cigarettes and a bottle of water. Then something strange happened. She looked over her shoulder. Twice. Nervous. Alert. The cashier later told investigators a dark pickup truck had pulled beside her car while she pumped gas. Older model. Mud on the sides. Driver unseen. Emily left less than 2 minutes later. The pickup followed shortly after. That image exploded across local news. Mystery truck sought in cold-blooded killing. Tip lines flooded instantly. Hundreds of calls. Angry ex-boyfriends. Suspicious drifters. Hunters with similar vehicles. Men reported by neighbors for acting strange. Cedar Ridge turned paranoid overnight. People locked doors that had stayed open for decades. Parents refused to let teenagers drive alone after sunset. Every passing pickup became a source of suspicion. Detective Harold Bennett led the investigation. 22 years on the force. Former military. Hard jaw. Permanent exhaustion behind the eyes. The kind of investigator who believed every killer eventually made a mistake. At first, he treated the case like any other homicide. Establish the timeline. Identify the victim's associates. Follow the evidence. But within days, the investigation spiraled into chaos. Emily's car was discovered abandoned 40 miles away near an old logging road. Interior wiped clean. No fingerprints. No weapon. No blood visible. Whoever dumped it had taken time. Careful time. Yet crime scene technicians recovered something microscopic from beneath the passenger seat. A tiny biological sample. almost invisible. Barely enough to test. In 1994, forensic technology was primitive compared to modern standards. The sample was catalogued anyway. Preserved. Filed into evidence no one realized would survive nearly 3 decades. The autopsy deepened the horror. Emily had not been killed immediately. She had been restrained for hours before death. There were traces of pine needles embedded in her clothing inconsistent with the ditch where her body was found. She had been moved. Held somewhere else first. Somewhere wooded. Somewhere isolated. Police searched cabins, trailers, abandoned campsites. Helicopters scanned forests surrounding Cedar Ridge. Divers dragged nearby lakes. Nothing. No secondary crime scene. No murder weapon. No eyewitnesses. Just rumors multiplying in every direction. Then came the first major break. A local mechanic named Travis Neal contacted police claiming he recognized the pickup truck shown on television. According to Neal, the vehicle belonged to a man named Daniel Mercer, a 33-year-old construction worker with a history of assault complaints and bar fights. Mercer lived alone outside town in a decaying property surrounded by dense woods. Detectives immediately obtained a warrant. The search terrified even veteran officers. Inside Mercer's trailer, investigators found women's jewelry stuffed inside kitchen drawers. Torn photographs. Handcuffs beneath the bed. Hunting knives lined perfectly across a basement wall. One officer later admitted the place felt wrong the second they entered. Like someone had been practicing darkness there for years. But nothing directly connected Mercer to Emily Grayson. No blood. No hair. No fibers. The jewelry couldn't be traced to known victims. Mercer denied everything calmly, almost casually. Yes, he owned a dark pickup. Yes, he drove near Route 17 that night. Yes, he stopped for gas around midnight. But he insisted he never saw Emily. Never spoke to her. Never followed her. Detectives interrogated him for nearly 11 hours. Mercer never cracked. He smoked cigarettes. Asked for coffee. Watched investigators with cold detached amusement. At one point he reportedly smiled while describing the media frenzy surrounding the murder. That smile haunted Detective Bennett for years afterward. Police searched deeper into Mercer's past and uncovered disturbing allegations stretching back over a decade. Former girlfriends accused him of violent behavior. One woman claimed he once tied her to a chair during an argument. Another said he stalked her for months after their breakup. Yet every accusation collapsed before reaching court. Lack of evidence. Witnesses backing out. Fear. Still, Bennett believed Mercer was their killer. The problem was belief meant nothing without proof. Weeks turned into months. Public pressure intensified. National media picked up the story after tabloids labeled Emily the rainstorm victim. Talk radio hosts accused police incompetence. Citizens organized candlelight vigils demanding justice. Cedar Ridge stopped feeling like a town and started feeling like a wound left open too long. Then another woman vanished. 29-year-old school teacher Rebecca Vance disappeared after leaving a supermarket less than 10 miles from where Emily's car had been abandoned. Her vehicle was found running behind an empty warehouse. Driver's door open. Groceries scattered across wet pavement. No Rebecca. Panic detonated instantly. For nearly 72 hours, authorities feared a serial predator was hunting women across the county. State police joined the investigation. FBI profilers arrived. News helicopters circled non-stop above search areas. Volunteers combed forests with flashlights through freezing rain. Rebecca reappeared alive 3 days later beside a highway overpass nearly 80 miles away. Barefoot. Injured. Disoriented. Her story shocked investigators. She claimed a masked man abducted her at knife point and held her inside a dark cabin somewhere in the woods. She described chains. Plastic tarps on walls. A radio constantly playing static. She never saw his face clearly. But one detail froze Detective Bennett completely. Rebecca said the man drove an older dark pickup truck with mud covering the doors. Daniel Mercer was arrested again within hours. But once more, the case unraveled. Rebecca failed to identify him in a lineup. No forensic evidence linked Mercer to the abduction site investigators never managed to locate. Defense attorneys attacked inconsistencies in Rebecca's traumatized memory. Prosecutors hesitated. Charges collapsed. Mercer walked free. The backlash destroyed public trust in law enforcement. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse carrying signs with Emily's photograph beside the words "How many more?" Bennett received anonymous threats accusing him of protecting killers. Reporters stalked officers leaving the station. Every failed lead intensified the feeling that something monstrous was moving through Cedar Ridge unseen. And then the murders stopped. No more disappearances. No more bodies. No dramatic confession. Just silence. The case slowly transformed into what investigators fear most. A cold file. Years passed. Evidence boxes gathered dust in storage rooms. Witnesses moved away or died. Detectives retired. New cases replaced old headlines. Teenagers who once whispered about Emily Grayson in school hallways became adults with families of their own. Yet the story never fully disappeared. Her photograph remained pinned inside the sheriff department's archives beside 3 words written in black marker: unsolved. Possible serial. Every anniversary brought fresh media coverage. 20 years without answers. Killer still free. Cold case nightmare continues. The same footage replayed endlessly. Rain falling on Route 17. Police lights flashing through darkness. Emily smiling forever from a yearbook photo taken before anyone knew fear would eventually swallow her name whole. Detective Bennett refused to let go. Even after retirement, he kept copies of evidence files stacked inside his garage. He reread witness statements obsessively. Revisited maps. Reviewed interrogation tapes late into the night. His wife once told friends the case aged him faster than war ever did. Bennett believed one mistake still existed somewhere buried inside thousands of pages. One overlooked detail waiting to surface. Then in the spring of 2022, nearly 28 years after Emily Grayson's murder, the phone rang inside the Cedar Ridge Sheriff's Office. A forensic analyst from the state crime lab had reopened old biological evidence using advanced DNA sequencing technology unavailable during the original investigation. The microscopic sample recovered beneath Emily's passenger seat had finally produced a complete genetic profile. Not partial, complete. And when technicians entered that profile into a national genealogy database designed to identify relatives of unknown suspects, one name surfaced almost immediately: Daniel Mercer. The room went silent after the name appeared on the screen. No dramatic music. No celebration. Just silence thick enough to suffocate everyone standing inside the forensic lab. For nearly 3 decades, investigators had chased ghosts through forests, interrogated broken witnesses, torn apart abandoned properties, and watched a killer walk free while an entire town rotted beneath unanswered questions. And now, after 28 years buried inside an evidence locker, a biological fragment smaller than a grain of salt had suddenly dragged the past back into the light. Daniel Mercer, the same man Detective Harold Bennett had spent half his life trying to lock away. The analyst explained it twice because Bennett barely heard the first explanation. The DNA profile extracted from the microscopic sample matched a close family relative already uploaded into a public genealogy database. Investigators built a family tree backward. Cousins. Uncles. Siblings. Then the line narrowed until only one realistic candidate remained. Male. Local to Cedar Ridge in 1994. Violent history. Owner of the truck seen near Emily Grayson hours before her death. Mercer. Bennett stared at the screen without blinking. Older now. Gray-haired. Wrists stiff with arthritis. But in that moment he looked exactly like the detective who had stood over Emily's body in the rain 28 years earlier. Exhausted. Furious. Haunted. The problem was Daniel Mercer had vanished years ago. After the Rebecca Vance investigation collapsed in the late 90s, Mercer sold his property outside Cedar Ridge and disappeared from public attention almost completely. He drifted across multiple states working temporary construction jobs under his real name. No marriage. No children. Several arrests for disorderly conduct and assault. Nothing major enough to keep him locked away. Every few years, another rumor surfaced. Someone claimed they saw him in Nevada, Arkansas, Montana, truck stops, bars, cheap motels along forgotten highways. Then the trail went cold again. Now investigators needed to find him before he realized the past was hunting him. Federal authorities quietly joined the operation. No public announcement. No press conference. Detectives feared Mercer might flee if news leaked. They began reconstructing his movements through employment records, driver's license renewals, utility bills, and surveillance databases. The search moved fast because everyone involved understood one terrifying possibility. If Mercer truly murdered Emily Grayson and abducted Rebecca Vance, there could be others. Unidentified victims, unreported disappearances, bodies hidden somewhere no one had searched. Investigators reopened storage boxes untouched for decades. Evidence photographs spread across conference tables. Old cassette interviews were digitized. Retired officers were called back for consultation. Every detail surrounding Mercer returned under a microscope. And the deeper they looked, the uglier the story became. A detective reviewing Mercer's old employment history discovered he had worked briefly for a highway maintenance crew traveling across 3 neighboring states during the early 90s. Another investigator uncovered reports involving missing women near several of those work sites. Most were dismissed at the time as runaways or unresolved disappearances. No confirmed connection existed. Yet the pattern chilled everyone in the room. Young women. Rural areas. Night disappearances. Vehicles abandoned. Then another discovery surfaced. In 2003, police in Oklahoma questioned Mercer after a woman escaped from a motel room claiming a man tried to restrain her with zip ties. Mercer denied involvement. Officers found no physical evidence linking him to the incident. The woman later failed to identify him positively. Case closed. Another close call. Another shadow slipping through cracks. Bennett stopped sleeping entirely. He spent nights inside the reopened task force office surrounded by fading photographs from the 90s. Emily's smiling face. Rebecca Vance recovering in a hospital bed. Grainy images of Mercer's trailer property before demolition crews tore it down years earlier. One photograph in particular disturbed him more than anything else. A picture taken during the original search warrant showed deep woods behind Mercer's trailer stretching endlessly into darkness. Bennett couldn't stop staring at it. Something about those trees bothered him. A feeling. An unfinished instinct buried beneath years of frustration. So investigators returned to the property. Almost nothing remained. The trailer was gone. The land abandoned. Nature had swallowed most traces of human existence. But excavation teams arrived with ground-penetrating radar anyway. Cadaver dogs searched through dense overgrowth while forensic archaeologists mapped suspicious soil disturbances hidden beneath decades of leaves and roots. On the second afternoon, one of the dogs alerted near a collapsed patch of earth 50 yards behind where Mercer's trailer once stood. Then another dog alerted beside it. Excavation began immediately. Within hours, investigators uncovered human remains. Female. Buried in a shallow grave wrapped in deteriorated plastic. News of the discovery leaked before authorities could contain it. By sunset, helicopters circled above the property while reporters shouted questions behind police barricades. Are there more victims? Is this connected to Emily Grayson? Did police miss bodies all these years? The county exploded into panic again. Forensic analysis identified the remains as 18-year-old Lisa Moreno, a convenience store clerk who disappeared in 1991 after leaving work 3 years before Emily's murder. Her case had remained unsolved for over 30 years. She was last seen walking toward her car during heavy rain. Heavy rain. Just like Emily. Search crews intensified excavation around the property. More remains surfaced days later. Then more. 3 additional women. 2 identified through dental records. 1 still unknown. All missing for decades. all connected to counties Mercer traveled through during temporary construction jobs. The revelation shattered Cedar Ridge. Daniel Mercer was no longer just a suspect in one brutal homicide. Investigators now believed they were hunting a serial killer who may have operated across multiple states for years without detection. And nobody knew where he was. Federal marshals distributed Mercer's photograph nationwide. Aging face. Thin frame. Hollow eyes. Television networks interrupted broadcasts with breaking news alerts describing him as armed, dangerous, and potentially responsible for multiple murders. The story detonated across the country. Cold case horror. Serial killer linked to DNA breakthrough. Buried secrets found after 30 years. Tips flooded hotlines by the thousands. A waitress in Kansas claimed Mercer ate at her diner 2 years earlier. A trucker reported seeing him outside Albuquerque. A motel owner in Arizona remembered a quiet man paying cash under the name Daniel M. Investigators chased every lead desperately while Bennett feared time running out. Men like Mercer rarely surrendered peacefully. If he realized authorities were closing in, someone else could die. Then came the phone call that changed everything again. A deputy from northern Montana reported a possible sighting near a remote campground outside Black Hollow County. An older man resembling Mercer had been living from a faded camper near the woods for several months. Locals described him as isolated, aggressive, paranoid. He avoided conversation. Paid cash only. Drove an aging dark pickup truck. The same truck model witnesses described in 1994. Federal agents mobilized immediately. The operation unfolded before dawn beneath freezing mountain rain. Tactical vehicles moved silently along dirt roads while helicopters circled miles away to avoid detection. Officers surrounded the campground at 4:37 a.m. The camper sat alone near a tree line illuminated by weak lantern light leaking through dirty curtains. Agents announced themselves. No response. Again they shouted. Nothing. Then a gunshot exploded from inside the camper. Chaos detonated instantly. Officers returned fire while others rushed toward cover. Another shot blasted through a side window. Glass sprayed across wet mud. One federal agent later described hearing animals screaming coming from inside, though investigators never confirmed whether the sound was Mercer or someone else. The standoff lasted less than 4 minutes. When tactical teams finally breached the camper, they found Daniel Mercer dead from a self-inflicted gunshot wound beneath the chin. A revolver remained clutched in his hand. Blood covered the interior walls. Rainwater dripped through shattered glass onto the floor beside him. But investigators noticed something strange immediately. Mercer had not been alone. Inside the camper, officers discovered women's clothing piled near the rear bed compartment. Fresh food supplies. 2 toothbrushes. And handcuffs bolted beneath the metal storage bench. Then they found the photographs. Dozens of them. Polaroids scattered inside shoe boxes and plastic bags. Women standing beside highways. Women pumping gas at night. Women apparently photographed from a distance without their knowledge. Some images dated back decades. Others appeared disturbingly recent. One photograph stopped investigators cold. A young woman with dark hair exiting a grocery store in Montana just 11 days earlier. Nobody could identify her. Search teams immediately expanded operations throughout Black Hollow County, fearing Mercer may have abducted someone before his death. Dogs searched nearby woods while officers interviewed residents across isolated mountain roads. 3 days later, authorities located a makeshift underground bunker hidden less than half a mile from Mercer's campsite. The bunker smelled like mold, gasoline, and decay. Inside, investigators found restraints attached to concrete walls. Blankets. Bottled water. Canned food. A battery-powered radio emitting low static through dead speakers. Exactly like Rebecca Vance described nearly 30 years earlier. Then forensic teams uncovered fresh blood. Not Mercer's. Female. Still unidentified. Panic surged through the investigation again. If the blood belonged to a recent victim, she could still be alive somewhere. Federal agents launched an urgent regional search spanning forests, rivers, abandoned roads, and nearby towns. The media frenzy intensified beyond anything Cedar Ridge experienced in the 90s. Cable networks broadcast non-stop coverage of Mercer's crimes while former investigators gave emotional interviews about missed chances and decades of failure. And through all of it, one question consumed everyone. How many women had Daniel Mercer really taken? Because investigators were beginning to fear the answer was far worse than anyone imagined. The bunker door creaked open under floodlights, revealing a space that felt less like a hideout and more like a preserved nightmare. Damp concrete walls, sweating with condensation. Air thick enough to taste. The kind of silence that doesn't feel empty, but occupied. Agents stepped inside slowly, weapons raised, flashlights cutting through darkness that seemed to resist being disturbed. And then they saw it. Names scratched into the wall with desperate, uneven pressure. Some carved deep. Some barely visible. A list without explanation. No dates. No context. Just fragments of human identity trapped in stone. Lisa Moreno. Rebecca Vance. Unknown female. And others that had no match in any database yet. Names that might have been victims. Or might have been guesses. Or might have been Mercer's private inventory of lives he had touched and erased. Detective Harold Bennett stood at the entrance, staring at the wall without moving. He had seen crime scenes for over 3 decades, but something about this place stripped away the usual distance investigators build to survive. There was no chaos here. No sudden violence. Only method. Control. Patience. The worst kind of criminal architecture. A forensic officer called out from the rear corner of the bunker. Blood evidence confirmed. Recent. Less than 2 weeks old. That sentence changed everything. If Mercer was dead upstairs, then someone else had been down here recently. Someone alive. Someone possibly taken after his death or during his final days of freedom. The timeline was no longer a closed case. It was expanding again, branching outward into uncertainty. Bennett moved deeper inside, past shelves lined with sealed containers. Inside them, hair ties, cheap jewelry, driver's licenses, forgotten wallets. Not valuables. Not trophies in the traditional sense. Something more disturbing. Identification stripped from ordinary lives and stored like archived proof of existence. Each item labeled with masking tape and dates that made no immediate sense. 1993, 1994, 1995, 1996, 1997. The pattern was not linear. It wasn't confined to a single period of Mercer's known activity. It suggested continuity. Either Mercer had been active far longer than anyone believed, or someone else had continued his work. That thought spread quietly through the team, unspoken but understood. Outside the bunker, rain intensified again, echoing like the night Emily Grayson was found nearly 3 decades earlier. Bennett felt the same pressure in his chest he remembered from that morning. The sense that time wasn't moving forward, but circling back to the same unresolved point. A younger agent approached him, voice lowered. "Sir, we've got something you need to see." They led him outside, across the muddy clearing, toward a second structure partially hidden beneath collapsed tarps and overgrown branches. It looked like an old storage shed at first. But inside, it was reinforced, insulated, modified. Someone had built extensions underground. Hidden rooms. The kind of construction that takes planning, knowledge, time. Inside one of those hidden rooms, they found photographs. Not the chaotic stacks from Mercer's camper. These were organized, pinned to boards, arranged with deliberate spacing, connected with strings and handwritten notes. A mapping system of human lives. Emily Grayson's photo sat at the center of one board. Not the original yearbook image, but a surveillance-style printout taken from a distance. She was leaving Marlowe's diner, head slightly turned, captured mid-step. Someone had been watching her long before that night on Route 17. Around her image were smaller notes. Gas station. 12:41 a.m. Route 17 eastbound. Weather, heavy rain. Target isolated. Bennett felt something shift inside him. Not just anger. Recognition. This wasn't just a crime scene reconstruction. It was a behavioral diary. A record of observation, planning, tracking. Emily hadn't been randomly encountered. She had been selected. Another board showed Rebecca Vance. Then Lisa Moreno. Then several unidentified women. Each with similar patterns. Late night movement. Isolated locations. Rainstorms appearing repeatedly in notes. As if weather itself was part of the selection process. A forensic analyst spoke quietly behind him. He didn't just choose victims, he waited for conditions. That detail changed the shape of the entire investigation. It wasn't opportunistic violence. It was environmental alignment. The storm wasn't incidental. It was part of the ritual. Darkness. Reduced visibility. Isolation. Chaos masking movement. Bennett stepped back from the boards, trying to force logic through decades of confusion. Mercer didn't have this level of organization, he said finally. Nobody responded immediately, because everyone in the room was thinking the same thing. The Mercer they had known 28 years ago had been impulsive, defensive, angry. But this system, this architecture of tracking and selection felt more refined. Almost clinical. Which raised a question no one wanted to ask. Had Mercer acted alone? A second wave of evidence came from digital recovery teams working through a buried storage compartment beneath the bunker floor. Hard drives. Old recording equipment. Portable cameras. Much of it damaged by moisture, but not completely destroyed. One technician managed to restore fragments of video files. The footage was grainy, black and white, recorded in low light. A woman sitting in what appeared to be a chair inside a dim room. Her face partially obscured. She was speaking, but audio was corrupted. Only fragments remained. He said, "I wasn't the first. There were others." The recording cut abruptly. Another file showed a different scene. A roadside view from inside a parked vehicle. Rain streaking across the windshield. A figure standing in the distance near a gas station. The camera zoomed slightly, revealing Emily Grayson alive. Hours before her disappearance. Watching, waiting, or being watched. The footage ended there. No continuation. No explanation. Bennett felt his stomach tighten. This wasn't just evidence of murder. It was surveillance spanning multiple years. Someone had been documenting lives in real time. And then the final discovery emerged from the deepest part of the bunker. A sealed metal box. Inside it, investigators found handwritten journals. Not Mercer's voice. The handwriting was different. Neater. More controlled. Entries dated across 2 decades. The earliest entries referenced Mercer by name, but not as the author. As the subject. That changed everything again. The journal described Mercer not as the architect, but as a participant. A follower. A man being instructed. Guided. One entry read, "He hesitates too much. The storm helps him become what he is meant to be." Another, "Emily Grayson responded correctly. Fear increases compliance." Bennett closed the journal slowly, his hands no longer steady. This was no longer a single killer narrative. This was a system, or something pretending to be one. Outside, the rain began to fall harder, turning the entire excavation site into mud and reflection. Flashlights scattered across wet ground like distant stars. Officers moved between structures in silence now, speaking less, observing more. The confidence that had arrived with Mercer's death was dissolving. Because even with Mercer gone, the evidence was growing. And the question no one dared say out loud was beginning to take shape in every mind on the site. If Mercer was not the origin of this pattern, then who taught him? And more terrifyingly, who continued it? The journals changed everything, but they also broke something inside the investigation that no one was prepared to name. Because once the idea of a single killer collapsed, the entire history of Cedar Ridge stopped feeling like a closed chapter and started feeling like a constructed illusion, carefully assembled over decades of missing pieces, false assumptions, and blind pursuit of the most visible suspect. Detective Harold Bennett refused to leave the command tent for hours after the discovery. The rain outside had turned the excavation site into a shifting field of mud and floodlights. But inside his mind there was no longer any separation between then and now. Emily Grayson's body in 1994. Rebecca Vance's trembling voice in the hospital. Lisa Moreno's shallow grave unearthed decades later. All of it was collapsing into a single unresolved shape that refused to stabilize. A forensic linguist was brought in overnight to analyze the journals. Her conclusion was immediate and unsettling. The writing shows two distinct cognitive patterns, she said. Same hand, but not always the same intent. She pointed to passages where tone shifted abruptly mid-entry. Sentences that began with structured observation suddenly dissolved into fragmented emotional language. Then returned to control again. As if the writer was not always alone in their own thoughts. Bennett listened without reacting, but something cold tightened in his chest. Inside Mercer's confirmed camper remains, investigators had already found physical evidence of isolation, bunk arrangements, stored food, surveillance materials. But the bunker network now suggested something more complex. Not just a hiding place. A monitored environment. A controlled space. A place where behavior was observed, recorded, possibly influenced. The forensic team classified the second structure as site of behavioral reinforcement. No one liked that phrase. It implied design, intent, and something far more disturbing than random violence. By morning, the FBI expanded the task force. Analysts from behavioral units arrived with fresh eyes and no emotional attachment to Cedar Ridge's history. They immediately challenged the Mercer-only narrative. One profiler laid out a new interpretation in blunt terms. If Mercer is involved, he is not the primary driver. He's either a facilitator or a conditioned actor. The room went silent again. Conditioned actor. Not a phrase anyone wanted attached to a serial homicide investigation involving decades of victims. But the evidence kept pointing away from simplicity. Digital recovery teams working through damaged drives extracted another fragment of footage from the bunker system. This one was clearer than the rest, though still degraded. A static camera view of a narrow hallway. A door at the end. Light flickering above it. A voice off camera speaking calmly, almost instructional. Repeat the sequence. A pause. Then a second voice. Male. Hesitant. I don't want to. A sharp interruption. Not loud. Controlled. Final. You already did. The footage ended abruptly. No faces were visible, but the tone alone rewired the direction of the investigation. This was not confession. It was instruction. Compliance. Enforcement of behavior through repetition or fear or something more systematic. Bennett watched the clip 3 times without speaking. Each replay removed another layer of certainty he had carried for decades. Outside, a new search perimeter had been established around Black Hollow County following Mercer's death. Forensic teams expanded into surrounding terrain, scanning for additional structures. What they found did not match expectations. 2 miles east of the bunker site, partially buried beneath collapsed soil and tree roots, another entrance was discovered. Smaller, older, less reinforced. Different construction style entirely. Inside, there were no photographs. No journals. No surveillance equipment. Only a single room. And a single object. A wooden chair bolted to the floor. Above it, on the wall, was a single phrase carved deeply into the concrete. The weather remembers. Bennett read it twice before stepping back. The phrase meant nothing on its own, yet its repetition across unrelated findings, Emily's case notes referencing storms, Mercer's behavioral timing during rainfall, the bunker surveillance logs flagged during heavy weather events, began to form a pattern that felt irrational but persistent. A meteorological correlation with human violence. A timing mechanism tied to environmental conditions. Or something investigators had been misinterpreting for decades as coincidence. One of the younger analysts suggested checking archived weather data across all confirmed victim disappearances. It took 6 hours to compile the comparison. When the results were finally displayed, The pattern was undeniable. Nearly every disappearance, assault, or confirmed abduction linked to Mercer or associated sites had occurred during heavy rainfall or severe storms. Not occasional, consistent, systematic. Bennett stared at the chart until the lines stopped making sense as statistics and started feeling like instructions. But correlation was not causation. He repeated that in his head like a shield. Correlation was not causation. Still, the repetition of storms could not be ignored anymore. By midday, another development shifted the entire case again. A retired officer from Cedar Ridge requested a private meeting with Bennett. His name was Richard Haldon. He had worked briefly on the original 1994 investigation before transferring out of homicide. He looked older than his records suggested, hands shaking slightly as he placed an old evidence folder on the table. "I never reported this," he said, "because I didn't know what it meant." Inside the folder were photocopies of interview notes from a woman named Carla Jennings, a motel clerk interviewed during the early stages of the Grayson case. At the time, her statements had been dismissed as unreliable. Stress, trauma, media influence. But Haldon had kept the originals. Carla had described something she claimed to have seen the night Emily disappeared. A second vehicle. Not the pickup truck. A dark sedan parked behind the gas station at 12:40 a.m., engine off, lights dimmed, positioned in a way that suggested observation rather than transit. She remembered it because it remained stationary even after Emily left. When investigators originally reviewed her statement, they focused entirely on the pickup truck detail. The sedan was ignored, classified as irrelevant. Now, decades later, it returned with weight. Bennett felt a slow pressure building behind his eyes. A second vehicle. A second presence. Haldon continued quietly. There was something else. She said she felt watched but not by the truck. That sentence landed heavier than anything else that day, because it suggested Emily Grayson was not simply followed. She was observed from multiple points. Coordinated, layered surveillance. And if that was true, then Mercer alone could not account for the full structure of the crime. The investigation shifted again overnight. Analysts re-examined all known cases, now searching for overlapping behavioral signatures, movement patterns, vehicle sightings, weather conditions, witness inconsistencies that had been previously dismissed. And slowly, a second profile began to emerge. Less violent, more observational, less physical, more procedural. A presence that did not match Mercer's confirmed behavioral history at all. Bennett sat alone in the command tent long after everyone else had left. The rain had returned again, steady and unrelenting, as if the environment itself was refusing to exit the narrative. On his desk were two folders now. One labeled Mercer. One newly created, labeled Unknown Association Pattern. He opened neither, because for the first time in 30 years, he was no longer sure which file contained the truth. And somewhere beyond the floodlights, beyond the excavated ground, beyond the newly uncovered structures that should have ended the story but instead expanded it, the investigation had crossed a threshold no one could reverse. The case was no longer about finding a killer. It was about identifying how many hands had been shaping the violence all along, and whether Cedar Ridge had ever truly been dealing with one mind, or something far more distributed, and far more patient, than anyone had been willing to imagine. The investigation stopped feeling like a straight line after the second profile emerged, because once the idea of a single offender collapsed, every piece of evidence stopped behaving like closure and started behaving like a signal that had been misread for decades. And the more analysts tried to separate Mercer from the structure surrounding him, the more the structure itself seemed to resist being dismantled, as if it had existed long before his name ever entered the case file and would continue existing even after his death had been confirmed in the train-soaked camper in Montana. It began with a quiet correction from the forensic lab that no one initially wanted to repeat out loud. The DNA profile extracted from the bunker site, the recent blood sample found in the underground chamber, did not match Daniel Mercer. Not partially. Not as a degraded sequence. It excluded him entirely. The genetic material belonged to an unidentified female, but the chain of transfer suggested something more complicated than a single victim scenario. There were secondary markers embedded in the sample, trace fragments that indicated repeated environmental contamination across multiple locations over time, as if the same biological source had been moving through different controlled spaces for years. The forensic analyst hesitated before summarizing it for Bennett. "This isn't a single event," she said. "It's recurring contact. Either with the same individual or within the same controlled environment system." That word again, system, returned like a bruise that refused to fade. Bennett asked for clarification, and what came next fractured the remaining certainty in the room. The lab had run isotope analysis on the biological residue, mapping environmental signatures embedded in the DNA. The results showed inconsistencies that did not align with a single geographic origin. Some markers matched forested inland climates consistent with Cedar Ridge and surrounding counties. Others matched high-altitude northern regions. And a smaller subset matched coastal humidity zones hundreds of miles away. The implication was unavoidable even before anyone said it. The sample had not stayed in one place. It had traveled, or had been moved deliberately across multiple environments. The task force reconvened within hours, this time with federal analysts and environmental forensic specialists included. Maps were spread across tables, locations marked in overlapping red circles that refused to resolve into a single pattern. Instead, they formed a network. Nodes connected by timing, weather events, and victim disappearances. Cedar Ridge was no longer the center of the case. It was just one intersection among many. A behavioral analyst from Washington broke the silence first. "If Mercer was the visible actor," he said carefully, "then this structure suggests logistical support. Movement coordination. Possibly observation continuity." Bennett leaned forward slightly. "You're saying someone helped him?" The analyst didn't answer immediately. He looked at the maps again, then at the fragmented weather logs pinned beside them. "I'm saying someone tracked him." That distinction changed everything. Because tracking implied awareness. Observation. Long-term attention. Not impulsive violence, not opportunistic crime, but sustained monitoring across decades. It reframed Mercer not as the architect of chaos, but as a component inside it. The team returned to Mercer's known movements, this time not searching for what he did, but for when he was observed doing it. Surveillance footage from old gas stations. Witness statements previously dismissed. Truck stop receipts. Cell tower pings reconstructed from retroactive network data. Patterns began to emerge. In multiple confirmed locations tied to Mercer, there were overlapping sightings of a second vehicle. Not always the same model. Not always the same color. But consistently present within a narrow time window of the primary incidents. A dark sedan appeared near Route 17 the night Emily Grayson disappeared. A similar vehicle was reported near the motel where Rebecca Vance was abducted. Another was logged near Lisa Moreno's last known location in 1991. Each time, the sedan was noted briefly and then ignored, because all attention had been focused on Mercer's pickup truck. Now those dismissed details returned with disturbing consistency. Bennett ordered a full reclassification of all witness statements involving secondary vehicles. Within 12 hours, analysts identified a pattern that had been hiding in plain sight for nearly 30 years. The sedan sightings were not random. They followed a radius of controlled proximity, never too close to interfere, never too distant to lose visual confirmation. Always positioned at observational distance during critical windows of victim transition. It looked less like coincidence and more like coordination. A field operative from Montana sent back a report that deepened the unease further. During interviews with residents near Black Hollow County, several individuals recalled a man who occasionally visited the area long before Mercer's final campsite was discovered. He was described inconsistently, sometimes older, sometimes younger, sometimes present only during storms. But one detail repeated across all accounts was identical. He never interacted with Mercer. He only observed. One witness described him sitting inside a parked vehicle during heavy rain, headlights off, watching the road for hours without moving. Another said he appeared after Mercer's arrival in the region, not before, as if following his path rather than leading it. That detail shifted the investigative theory again. If Mercer was being observed, then the violence attributed to him might have been influenced, directed, or even recorded by someone else operating at a distance. Bennett requested access to Mercer's financial records again, this time with expanded forensic accounting support. What they found was unexpected. Mercer's income over the years did not match his known employment history. There were unexplained deposits at irregular intervals, always in cash equivalents, always routed through temporary accounts that dissolved after withdrawal. The pattern suggested external funding, not large sums, but consistent maintenance-level support, enough to keep someone mobile, enough to sustain long-term travel without formal employment. But the most disturbing discovery came from a reconstructed communications archive pulled from outdated satellite relay logs. Buried in fragmented data packets, analysts recovered partial radio transmissions dated across multiple years. The audio was degraded, but patterns of structured communication were clear. Short phrases, repeated intervals, minimal emotional tone, site confirmed, movement observed, weather window active, continue sequence. The phrase weather window appeared multiple times. Bennett immediately revisited the earlier meteorological correlation. Heavy rain, storms, low visibility conditions consistently aligned with confirmed incidents. At first it had seemed like environmental coincidence. Now it began to resemble operational planning. A tactical psychologist was brought in to interpret the implication. Her conclusion was cautious but direct. If weather conditions are consistently tied to activity windows, she said, then weather is not incidental. It is being used as a constraint environment, either for concealment, timing, or behavioral conditioning. That word, conditioning, hung in the air longer than anything else, because it suggested Mercer was not simply choosing victims during storms. It suggested he might have been trained to operate within them. The investigation shifted again toward Mercer's earliest known years. Before Cedar Ridge. Before Emily Grayson. Before any confirmed homicide. Records from the late 1980s and early 1990s revealed Mercer had undergone multiple short-term employment placements through subcontracted infrastructure companies operating across state lines. These companies handled highway expansion, bridge maintenance, and rural surveying work, jobs that required frequent travel through remote regions with minimal oversight. During this period, another name began appearing in peripheral documentation. Not in official employment records, but in contractor logs, travel approvals, and equipment dispatch notes. A recurring supervisor identifier, RH. No full name. Just initials. Attached to Mercer's assignments in multiple states. The analyst flagged it immediately. This individual had administrative oversight of Mercer's mobility patterns during early exposure years. Bennett felt a subtle shift inside his chest when he saw the notation. It was the first time in decades a non-victim, non-offender presence had appeared consistently alongside Mercer's earliest timeline. He requested identity verification. Within hours, they traced RH to a retired civil logistics coordinator named Raymond Holloway, now deceased for 12 years. His personnel file was extensive, but unremarkable at first glance. Yet one detail stood out. Holloway had worked briefly with state emergency response coordination units during severe weather deployment operations in the late 1980s. Storm response logistics, weather-linked movement control. The pattern was returning again, tightening around the same environmental axis. But when investigators attempted to retrieve Holloway's personal archives, they discovered his residence had been cleared years earlier. No records remained. No digital footprint. Only fragmented references in third-party employment systems. And then another discovery arrived that complicated everything further. A private storage facility in Oregon contacted federal authorities after a sealed unit registered to a defunct contractor account was flagged during a routine audit. Inside the unit, investigators found analog surveillance equipment, notebooks filled with weather charts, and dozens of photographs spanning nearly 2 decades. Many of the images featured Daniel Mercer, but not all of them. Some showed unknown individuals. Observers. Men and women positioned at distances, documenting movement rather than participating in it. One recurring figure appeared in multiple photographs, always partially obscured, always positioned near vehicles during rainfall events. A dark sedan was visible in the background of several images. The same sedan. The realization settled heavily across the investigation. Mercer had not been acting in isolation. He had been operating within a monitored framework. And someone had been documenting the entire process for years without ever being detected. Bennett closed the evidence folder slowly, feeling the investigation tilt beneath him once again. Every answer so far had only multiplied the questions. Every resolved point had revealed a larger perimeter. Outside, the rain returned to Cedar Ridge in uneven waves, as if responding to something no one could see. And in the silence that followed, one conclusion began forming across the task force without being formally spoken. If Daniel Mercer was only a participant, then the real origin of the violence had never been inside the bunker. It had been outside it, watching, measuring, and waiting for the next storm. The discovery of the storage unit in Oregon should have brought clarity, but instead it widened the case in a way that felt almost deliberate, as if every time investigators pulled one thread, the entire structure of the investigation responded by expanding into something larger, more layered, and harder to define, until even experienced federal analysts began to admit privately that they were no longer simply reconstructing a murder case, but reconstructing an entire operational history that may have stretched across multiple states, multiple decades, and possibly multiple hands working in coordination without ever appearing connected on paper. Inside the Oregon unit, the photographs were laid out again under controlled lighting, this time with forensic imaging specialists enhancing background details that had been previously overlooked. The dark sedan appeared in at least 7 confirmed images tied to different locations and years. It was never centered, never emphasized, always positioned at the edge of frames, partially obscured by rain streaks, fog, or reflective glare from wet asphalt. But now that analysts were actively searching for it, the pattern became impossible to ignore. It was always present during Mercer-related activity windows, always during storms, always at distance, never interacting, just observing. A behavioral analyst pointed out something that changed the tone of the room immediately. "This is not passive surveillance," he said. "This is structured observation timing. Someone is coordinating field presence with environmental conditions and subject movement." Bennett leaned forward slightly. "Subject?" The analyst nodded toward Mercer's photos. "Mercer is behaving like a subject under observation protocol." That phrase landed with weight because it inverted everything the investigation had assumed. Mercer was no longer being treated as the origin point of violence. He was being reclassified as an entity within a monitored system. A system that still had an observer and possibly an operator. As the team expanded its review of Oregon materials, another layer emerged from handwritten notebooks recovered inside the unit. These were not Mercer's journals, nor the fragmented writings found in the bunker. The handwriting here was different again, clean, deliberate, and emotionally detached. The entries were structured like field reports rather than personal reflections. Each page contained a date, a weather condition, a location, and a short observational summary. Subject demonstrates increased compliance under low visibility conditions. Storm activity correlates with reduced resistance during engagement windows. Secondary observer presence confirmed at perimeter distance. That last line triggered immediate attention. Secondary observer presence confirmed. Bennett read it twice before speaking. "There's more than one observer." No one contradicted him, because the language did not suggest speculation. It suggested documentation, repetition, validation across multiple entries. The implication was clear even if no one wanted to articulate it fully. Mercer was being watched by someone who was also being watched. The task force split its focus again. One unit continued analyzing Mercer's confirmed criminal history. Another focused on mapping environmental correlations. A third began tracing any individual connected to early logistical coordination records tied to Mercer's employment period. It was during this third review that a new name surfaced, quietly at first, buried in old contractor correspondence that had been partially digitized but never fully analyzed. A recurring signature on approval documents. Initials, RH, the same initials previously linked to early employment coordination. But this time, analysts found something new. A handwritten annotation on a damaged routing slip from 1991. The note was brief, almost casual. Keep subject within expected exposure zones. Weather alignment required for stabilization. Bennett felt something tighten in his chest as he read it. Subject. Exposure zones. Stabilization. These were not words used in standard criminal activity. They belonged to systems thinking. Behavioral structuring. Controlled environmental manipulation. He requested all known records tied to RH be re-evaluated with expanded scope. Within hours, analysts confirmed that the initials corresponded to Raymond Holloway, a logistics coordinator involved in infrastructure planning and emergency deployment scheduling across multiple states during the late 1980s and early 1990s. On paper, Holloway's work was administrative. But when investigators reconstructed his assignments, a pattern emerged that no one could easily dismiss. Every region where Mercer was deployed for construction work had overlapping periods where Holloway was also present in a coordinating capacity. Not physically in the same location, but operationally connected through scheduling systems that determined workforce movement across rural infrastructure projects. It meant Mercer's mobility during his early adulthood had not been random. It had been structured, controlled through employment systems that dictated when and where he would travel. A federal analyst studying the overlap made a quiet observation. If someone wanted to study behavior under isolation and environmental stress conditions, this would be an effective framework. No one responded immediately, because the idea was no longer theoretical. It was embedded in the data. Meanwhile, field teams in Black Hollow County continued processing recovered materials from Mercer's final known campsite. Among the debris, forensic specialists uncovered something unexpected, an old, weathered logbook buried beneath the ground near the campsite perimeter. Unlike the bunker journals, this logbook was not observational or analytical. It was operational. Entries were short, direct, time-stamped. Subject arrives. Condition stable. Storm predicted. Prepare observation window. Sedan maintains perimeter position. Behavioral deviation noted. Adjustment required. The entries stopped abruptly 6 weeks before Mercer's death. But the handwriting did not match Mercer. It matched neither of the previously identified writing styles. This introduced a new complication that shifted the investigation again. If Mercer had been a subject and someone else had been observing, then who authored the operational log, and where were they now? Bennett requested a full linguistic comparison across all recovered documents. The results came back with another unsettling conclusion. The logbook, Oregon journals, and bunker surveillance notes all shared subtle structural similarities in phrasing patterns. Not identical handwriting, but consistent linguistic framing. The same terminology. The same conceptual structure. As if multiple individuals were operating under a shared methodology or a shared doctrine. A doctrine that treated human behavior as a controlled variable influenced by environment, isolation, and timing. The psychological consultant assigned to the case summarized it cautiously during a briefing. This is beginning to resemble a distributed behavioral system. Not centralized control. Distributed execution with shared observational protocols. Bennett exhaled slowly. So Mercer wasn't the only one acting. No, she said. He may not have even been the primary actor. That sentence reframed everything again. Because if Mercer was not the primary actor, then his suicide in the Montana camper did not resolve the case. It only removed one component from a larger structure that remained intact. The investigation shifted focus toward identifying remaining active nodes within the system. Analysts began cross-referencing cold case disappearances across multiple states, searching for similarities in timing, weather conditions, and environmental context. Within days, they identified a cluster of unsolved cases across 3 counties in different states that shared identical characteristics. All occurred during severe storms, all involved late-night travel conditions, and all showed evidence of vehicle surveillance prior to disappearance. And in 2 of those cases, witnesses had reported a dark sedan parked at a distance. Still observing, still present. The task force now operated under a new assumption. though none of them stated it openly in official reports. Mercer had been one node. The bunker had been one site. Oregon had been one archive. But the system itself had not been located. Only its fragments. And somewhere beyond the overlapping maps and recovered journals, Cedar Ridge began to feel like a single point inside something much larger that no one had fully visualized yet. As the day ended, Bennett stood alone outside the command tent, watching rain sweep across the excavation site again. Floodlights reflected off wet ground in broken patterns, like fragments of memory trying to form coherence. He thought about Emily Grayson one more time, not as a victim in a file, but as a subject who had been observed long before she ever knew she was part of anything at all. And for the first time since the investigation reopened, he understood the most unsettling possibility of all. That the question was no longer who killed Emily Grayson, but who decided she was worth watching in the first place. The question of who was watching Emily Grayson could not be contained once it entered the investigation, because it shifted the entire case away from physical evidence and towards something far more unstable: intent without presence, observation without contact, and influence that left no clear fingerprint, only patterns that emerged after decades of hindsight, like a photograph slowly developing in chemicals that had been mixed too late to prevent the image from forming. By the seventh day of the expanded federal operation, Cedar Ridge was no longer the center of activity. It had become a reference point, a historical anchor, while analysts built a broader map that extended across multiple states and decades. The dark sedan, once treated as a minor anomaly, was now a critical object of interest, designated internally as Observer Vehicle A, though no one could confirm whether it represented a single entity or multiple vehicles following a shared pattern. Surveillance analysts began reconstructing highway traffic data from archived toll records, gas station logs, and environmental camera systems that had survived in fragmented form. What they found did not resemble random sightings. Instead, the sedan appeared at intervals that aligned with known behavioral events tied to Mercer's movements, always arriving before him, never after, and always disappearing shortly after the critical window of disappearance or abduction. One analyst described it bluntly during a briefing. "It behaves like a lead indicator," he said. "Not reacting to events. Positioning before them." That statement reframed the sedan again, not as a follower, but as a predictor. And prediction implied knowledge or preparation. Meanwhile, field teams returned to Cedar Ridge archives to re-interview surviving witnesses from the original 1994 investigation. Most were older now, their memories faded or reshaped by time, but one statement repeatedly resurfaced from multiple unrelated individuals who had never been officially connected before. A second figure had been seen near Route 17 during the night Emily Grayson disappeared. Not in the gas station footage, not in the diner timeline, but along the highway itself. A stationary silhouette in a parked vehicle positioned at a distance where headlights barely reached. Witnesses described it inconsistently, but the pattern of description remained the same: engine off, windows fogged, presence felt more than clearly observed. One witness, now in his 70s, struggled to recall specifics but insisted on one detail. "It wasn't moving like the other truck," he said. "It was waiting. Like it already knew what was going to happen." That phrase, "already knew," triggered immediate attention from behavioral analysts, because it implied foreknowledge, not coincidence. The investigation split again, this time focusing on temporal sequencing. If the sedan consistently appeared before Mercer, then Mercer's actions might have been anticipated rather than spontaneous. That led analysts to re-examine Mercer's psychological profile reconstructed from interrogation records, prison evaluations, and behavioral observations from the Rebecca Vance case. What they found contradicted earlier assumptions. Mercer's documented behavior showed increasing reliance on external cues during later incidents. Inconsistencies in timing. Hesitation before actions. Delayed responses during critical decision windows. These were subtle, previously dismissed as stress responses or fatigue, but now they appeared in a different light. Not independent decision-making, but reaction. A forensic psychologist assigned to the case summarized the implication carefully during a closed session. "If Mercer was being observed in real time," she said, then his behavior could have been reinforced or adjusted based on external observation feedback loops. Bennett immediately asked what that meant operationally. She hesitated before answering. It means someone could have been guiding escalation patterns without ever physically intervening. The room went quiet again, because guidance without contact was no longer theory in this case. It was already partially supported by the logs, the journals, the environmental correlations, and the timing structure of known incidents. The system was beginning to resemble something adaptive, responsive, and possibly iterative, as if each event was not isolated, but part of a learning sequence. The breakthrough came unexpectedly from a digitized archive in a regional transportation authority database. A retired data engineer reviewing old infrastructure monitoring files noticed repeated anomalies in traffic sensor logs along rural highways during the early 1990s. Vehicles appeared in detection zones without corresponding entry or exit records. These anomalies had been flagged at the time as equipment errors. But when cross-referenced with known Mercer-related locations, a pattern emerged. The same anomalies occurred within hours or minutes of confirmed disappearances. And in several cases, a second vehicle signature appeared just outside the detection radius. The dark sedan. The engineer flagged the pattern and sent it directly to the federal task force. Within hours, analysts reclassified the sedan as a persistent observational asset with potential predictive routing capability. Not a single vehicle, but possibly a rotating presence fulfilling the same function across different regions. That possibility introduced a new level of complexity, because it meant the observer might not be an individual. It might be a role or a system function distributed across multiple operators. Bennett requested immediate consolidation of all known Mercer-era records, focusing specifically on personnel overlaps in infrastructure projects, emergency coordination units, and subcontracted logistics firms. The analysis revealed something unexpected. A recurring administrative designation appeared across multiple unrelated systems. A code used to mark environmental field observation compliance review. The initials associated with this designation were consistent across documents spanning years. R.H. Raymond Halloway. The name had already appeared before, but now its significance expanded. Halloway was no longer just a logistical coordinator. He was now linked, at least indirectly, to environmental deployment frameworks that intersected with Mercer's mobility timeline and the observed timing of disappearance events. But Halloway had been dead for over a decade, which meant either the system had ended with him, or it had continued without requiring his physical presence. A digital forensic specialist reviewing archived communications made another discovery that shifted the case again. Hidden within corrupted satellite relay logs from the late 1990s, fragments of structured communication were recovered. The messages were brief, coded, and consistently tied to weather conditions. Storm window confirmed. Observer position maintained. Subject progression stable. Sequence continues. The phrasing suggested continuity beyond individual operators. A protocol rather than a person. Bennett read the reconstructed messages alone that night. The command tent was empty except for the sound of rain hitting reinforced canvas. Each phrase felt less like evidence and more like instruction that had never stopped being active. He began to see Emily Grayson not as the beginning of the case, but as one entry point into a larger operational framework that may have existed before her disappearance and continued after Mercer's death. The question had changed again without permission. It was no longer about Mercer. It was no longer even about Cedar Ridge. It was about whether the pattern they were uncovering represented something still active somewhere in the present. Because if the messages described a sequence that continues, then the most disturbing implication was not that the past had been misunderstood, but that it might still be unfolding in real time. And somewhere, outside the floodlights, beyond the maps and reconstructed timelines, the investigators could not shake the growing certainty that observation had not ended. It had only expanded its field of view. The realization that the sequence might still be active did not arrive as a dramatic announcement, but as a slow erosion of certainty inside the task force, because once the idea of a continuing system took hold, every piece of evidence stopped belonging to the past and began behaving like a fragment of something still in motion, something that had never truly paused, only shifted location, changed surface, and adapted its visibility to whatever environment investigators were currently looking at. By the 8th week, Cedar Ridge was no longer an active crime scene in the traditional sense. It had become a layered excavation site of memory, data, and environmental reconstruction, where teams were working simultaneously in the field and inside digital archives, attempting to map a structure that refused to align into a single origin point. The rain had returned again, as it always did during key breakthroughs, saturating the soil, softening excavation edges, and blurring the boundary between physical evidence and suggestion. Inside the command center, analysts were now treating the observer vehicle designation as a placeholder for a broader category rather than a single car. The dark sedan sightings had multiplied across historical datasets once they expanded the search parameters. It was no longer confined to Mercer-linked cases. Similar patterns appeared in unrelated disappearances across different regions, always under severe weather conditions, always involving isolated rural routes, and always preceded by brief, non-interactive vehicle presence at a distance. One analyst finally voiced what others had been avoiding. "We may be looking at an observational methodology, not a vehicle." The sentence hung in the air without immediate response, because it suggested the sedan was not the subject of investigation, but an expression of something else operating behind it. Meanwhile, forensic teams working through Mercer's reconstructed movement timeline identified a gap that had previously gone unnoticed. A 6-week period in late 1992 where Mercer's location could not be reliably confirmed. Employment records showed he was still assigned to infrastructure work in northern transit corridors, but no physical sightings, no traffic logs, and no corroborated witness statements placed him at any verifiable site during that interval. It was as if he had been temporarily removed from observable space, or operating outside it. Bennett requested every available record tied to that window. What returned was a fragmented set of contractor communications involving temporary reassignment protocols under emergency weather deployment conditions. The same terminology appeared again: storm window activation, subject relocation, observation stabilization. But this time, something else was attached to the file. A handwritten note in the margin of a routing document. "Do not allow subject to deviate during exposure cycle." No signature. Only initials. RH. The reappearance of Raymond Holloway's designation reignited the debate inside the task force, but this time the focus shifted away from whether he had been involved, and toward whether his role represented something larger than individual participation. A systems engineer brought in from Federal Logistics explained it in operational terms. "In complex distributed monitoring systems," he said, "you don't always need the operator to be present at every point. You need protocol consistency." If Holloway established the framework, the system could persist beyond him. That idea unsettled the room more than any prior revelation, because it suggested continuity without identity, a structure that outlived its originators. Field teams then reported a new development from Black Hollow County that escalated the urgency again. During a secondary sweep of terrain surrounding Mercer's final campsite, investigators discovered another buried structure, smaller than the bunker and the Oregon storage unit, but constructed with similar materials and orientation patterns. Inside, there were no photographs or journals, only recording equipment, and a wall-mounted panel displaying weather data logs spanning nearly 25 years. Each log marked with identical annotations. Exposure window active. Subject aligned. Observer position confirmed. But there was something different this time. A third marker appeared in several entries. Not Mercer. Not RH. A designation that had not been seen before. Internal node. No explanation accompanied it. Just repetition across multiple years. Bennett stood in front of the panel for a long time, reading the same phrase over and over as if repetition might eventually produce meaning. Instead, it produced the opposite effect. The more he looked at it, the more it felt like classification rather than description. Someone, or something, had been labeled as part of the system itself. Not an outsider observing it, but an element within it. At that moment, one of the analysts entered with a new file extracted from restored satellite communication archives. The file contained a series of partially corrupted transmissions dated between 1993 and 2005. Unlike earlier fragments, these messages included alternating identifiers, suggesting multiple voices or endpoints within the same communication structure. Subject movement confirmed. External observation steady. Internal node deviation detected. Corrective alignment initiated. Bennett read the final line twice. Corrective alignment. The phrase carried no emotional tone, but its implications were immediate. It suggested intervention. Adjustment. Not punishment, but correction of behavior within a controlled system. A behavioral psychologist assigned to the case offered a restrained interpretation. If this language is consistent, she said, then we are not looking at isolated criminal acts. We are looking at managed behavioral outcomes. That sentence reframed the entire structure again. Because if behavior was being managed, then violence was not spontaneous. It was regulated. Possibly even calibrated. The investigation now split into three parallel hypotheses that no longer contradicted each other but overlapped in increasingly uncomfortable ways. Mercer as independent offender. Mercer as conditioned subject. Mercer as operational component within a distributed system. None of them could be fully disproven. And none of them could fully explain the totality of evidence alone. The most troubling breakthrough came later that night when analysts revisited witness statements from the original Emily Grayson investigation, this time applying behavioral reconstruction modeling rather than traditional timeline sorting. One statement, previously dismissed as unreliable, began to align with new data points. A truck driver who had passed Route 17 that night recalled not just the pickup truck, but something else he could never fully explain. A second presence. Stationary. Not moving toward or away from anything. Like it was watching the road instead of traveling on it, he had said during his original interview. At the time, it had been ignored. Now it aligned with every pattern they had uncovered. Bennett requested a full reconstruction of Route 17 activity during the exact time window of Emily Grayson's disappearance, integrating weather data, traffic flow, and all known vehicle sightings. The simulation produced a result that no one initially trusted. Three distinct positional clusters appeared. Not two, not one. Three. One matched Emily's vehicle trajectory. One matched the pickup truck associated with Mercer. And the third cluster, faint but persistent, aligned with stationary positioning near a blind curve outside the gas station. A position consistent with observation rather than transit. The dark sedan. But this time, the simulation revealed something else beneath the pattern. A temporal offset. The sedan's presence consistently preceded Mercer's movement by several minutes, suggesting not simultaneous observation, but anticipatory positioning. As if the system knew where Mercer would be before he arrived. Bennett leaned back from the screen slowly. Because that possibility changed the entire framework again. If Mercer was being observed, and if his behavior was being guided, then the observer was not simply watching events unfold. It was predicting them, and possibly shaping them before they occurred. Outside the command center, the rain intensified again, hitting the canvas roof in steady rhythmic impact that sounded almost like repetition rather than weather. Inside, no one spoke for several minutes. Because the investigation had reached a point where every answer no longer resolved uncertainty. It expanded it. And somewhere within that expanding structure, the most disturbing realization began forming without being spoken aloud. If behavior could be predicted, then it could also be reproduced. And nothing they had uncovered so far suggested this system had ever stopped operating. By the ninth phase of the investigation, the case no longer behaved like a reconstruction of past events, but like a live model constantly updating itself with new interpretations, because every time analysts believed they had isolated a core structure, another layer of evidence emerged that forced them to reconsider not only what had happened in Cedar Ridge, but how long the mechanisms behind those events might have been operating without interruption, hidden beneath administrative systems, weather data, transportation logs, and the overlooked margins of old investigation files that had once been dismissed as irrelevant. Inside the command center, the atmosphere had shifted into something colder than exhaustion. It was not fear in the traditional sense, but a persistent awareness that the investigation itself had become unpredictable. Even routine updates felt like interruptions from something larger that was no longer contained by geography or timeline. The maps on the walls no longer represented a single county or a single offender network, they represented intersections of behavior, environment, and observation patterns that stretched across states and decades. The dark sedan, once labeled Observer Vehicle A, had evolved in classification again. Analysts no longer treated it as a physical object. It was now referred to internally as perimeter presence, a term that reflected their inability to confirm whether they were tracking one vehicle or a repeating operational function embedded within multiple contexts. What unsettled them most was not its presence, but its consistency across conditions. Every confirmed appearance aligned with severe weather events. Every disappearance cluster occurred during low visibility storms. And every Mercer-linked activity window showed a preceding phase of observation that never interacted directly with victims, suspects, or law enforcement. It simply arrived first and left last. A federal data specialist stood before the briefing screen late that night, pointing at a layered visualization of all known incidents tied to the pattern. If we strip away identity, he said, what remains is timing logic. This isn't behavior driven by impulse. It's behavior structured around environmental triggers. Bennett studied the display without speaking. The overlapping timelines created a shape that was no longer random. It resembled something closer to a framework. A system designed to operate only under specific atmospheric conditions, as if weather itself was a required component in the sequence of events. That idea should have sounded absurd. But the data refused to collapse under scrutiny. Meanwhile, a separate forensic team working through the Oregon archives made another discovery that deepened the structural complexity of the case. Hidden within a degraded external hard drive, they recovered a partially intact directory labeled phase logs. Inside were hundreds of short entries, each formatted identically and time-stamped across nearly 2 decades. Each entry contained 3 components: weather condition, subject status, observer confirmation. At first, the entries appeared repetitive, almost automated. But linguistic analysis revealed subtle variations in phrasing that suggested human input rather than machine generation. That meant someone, or multiple people, had been actively documenting behavioral progression over time. One entry stood out in particular. Storm intensity optimal. Subject exhibits high compliance. Internal node interference detected. Observer repositioned. Bennett requested clarification on the term internal node again, but this time the analysts hesitated before responding. The phrase had appeared in multiple datasets, including bunker walls, satellite logs, and handwritten journals, always without explanation. Now it was appearing in structured logs, suggesting it was not an anomaly but a defined category within the system. A behavioral systems expert was brought in remotely to interpret the pattern. After reviewing the logs for nearly an hour, she finally spoke with caution. If these records are consistent, she said, then we are looking at a multi-tier observation architecture. Subjects, observers, and internal nodes may represent different functional roles within the same operational structure. Bennett asked the question everyone was thinking but no one wanted to phrase directly. Roles within what? The analyst hesitated. A behavioral management system that operates through environmental synchronization. The words landed heavily in the room because it suggested intentional design. Not just tracking, not just surveillance, but a structured system that used environmental conditions, specifically storms, as activation points for behavioral processes. At the same time, field teams in Black Hollow County reported another anomaly. During continued excavation near Mercer's campsite, they uncovered a buried communication device encased in waterproof housing. Unlike previous equipment, this device was still partially functional due to its insulation design. When powered briefly for extraction, it automatically initiated a playback sequence. The audio was distorted but recognizable as structured dialogue. Subject stable under exposure conditions. Observer confirmation received. Sequence continuity maintained. Then a pause, followed by a voice that had not been identified in any previous recordings. Low. Controlled. detached. Proceed to next cycle. The recording ended. No identification markers. No context. Just instruction. Bennett listened to the playback twice before asking for isolation of the voice frequency profile. The forensic audio team began processing it immediately, comparing it against known Mercer recordings, bunker logs, and recovered satellite fragments. Early results indicated something unexpected. The voice did not match Mercer. It did not match any known associate. But it matched tonal patterns found in several of the earliest Oregon phase logs. Which meant continuity. Not of identity, but of function. Later that evening, a separate breakthrough emerged from the reanalysis of Emily Grayson's case timeline. Using enhanced reconstruction modeling, analysts overlaid environmental conditions, vehicle positions, and witness statements into a single synchronized sequence. What emerged was a three-layer structure that had never been formally recognized during the original investigation. The first layer, Emily's movements. The second layer, Mercer's vehicle trajectory. The third layer, stationary perimeter presence consistent with the dark sedan. But this time, a fourth anomaly appeared. A brief interruption in environmental correlation data. A gap where no vehicle, no witness, and no confirmed movement should have existed. Yet during that gap, Emily's last confirmed activity at the gas station overlapped with an unidentified stationary signal near Route 17 that had not been attributed to any known vehicle or individual. It did not move. It did not interact. It simply existed within the system window. A presence without classification. Bennett stared at the reconstruction for a long time, because it meant something no one wanted to articulate. The system had elements they could not yet identify. Not Mercer. Not the sedan. Not RH. Something else. Something that did not appear in logs, but influenced timing itself. As the night deepened, rain began to fall again over Cedar Ridge, heavier than before, saturating the excavation site and dissolving the edges of physical evidence into indistinct shapes. Floodlights reflected off wet ground in fractured patterns that made distance difficult to judge. Inside the command center, silence returned. Not because there was nothing left to analyze, but because every new layer of analysis led to the same uncomfortable conclusion. The investigation was no longer moving toward a resolution. It was moving deeper into a structure that appeared designed to expand whenever it was examined. And somewhere beyond the reconstructed timelines, beyond Mercer's confirmed death, beyond the Oregon archives and the bunker systems, the question that had begun as a simple homicide inquiry had transformed into something far more unstable. Not who committed the crimes, but what kind of system ensured they kept happening under the right conditions, and whether that system had ever required a single person to control it at all. By the 10th phase of the investigation, Cedar Ridge no longer felt like a place on a map but like a coordinate embedded inside a much larger pattern that kept revealing itself in fragments, because every new dataset, every recovered archive, and every reconstructed timeline kept circling back to the same uncomfortable conclusion: the case was not converging toward closure, it was expanding into structure, as if the act of investigation itself was activating additional layers of something that had always been waiting to be observed. The command center had been relocated twice in 3 days due to worsening weather conditions, each storm arriving with unnerving precision at the moment major analytical breakthroughs occurred. At first, it was dismissed as coincidence. Then it became a running silence among the staff. No one said it aloud anymore, but everyone noticed it. Heavy rain meant new evidence. Thunder meant new anomalies. And lightning, according to one exhausted analyst, seemed to coincide with the most disruptive discoveries. That night, lightning struck again. And with it came the final reconstruction file from the Oregon archive. The file was labeled simply, Continuity Map, Phase Unknown. When opened, it did not contain standard case documentation. Instead, it displayed a multi-layered behavioral network visualization spanning decades. Nodes were not labeled by names, but by functions. Subject node, observer node, internal node, environmental trigger node. Each category was linked by temporal lines that did not follow geographic logic, but operational timing. Emily Grayson appeared in the system not as an isolated victim, but as a subject activation event. Rebecca Vance was labeled secondary compliance deviation. Lisa Moreno appeared as baseline exposure outcome. And Daniel Mercer was marked in multiple layers simultaneously. Subject node. Execution proxy. Behavioral relay. Bennett stared at the screen for a long time before speaking. "This is not a criminal profile map," he said quietly. "It's a system diagram." No one disagreed, because the structure on the screen did not resemble a conventional investigative reconstruction. It resembled a designed environment in which human behavior had been segmented into roles, conditions, and outcomes, all dependent on external variables that could be predicted, monitored, and potentially influenced. Then, at the center of the visualization, something else appeared. A node that had no name, no identifier, only a symbol. A blank classification marker that pulsed faintly as if still active within the dataset. One analyst leaned closer. "That node isn't assigned," he said. "It's undefined." Bennett felt a slow tightening in his chest as he studied it. Undefined nodes did not exist in standard behavioral modeling. Every element in a structured system required classification. Without it, the model should collapse or flag as corrupted. But this one remained stable, which meant it was either an error the system had learned to ignore, or something the system could not classify. A containment analyst broke the silence. "If Mercer is a subject node," she said carefully, "and the sedan represents observation presence, then this undefined node may represent system-level control or anomaly behavior." No one responded immediately, because the implication was too large to comfortably hold in a single explanation. Meanwhile, field teams in Montana confirmed the full clearance of Mercer's final campsite and surrounding bunker network. The underground bunker, Oregon storage unit, and secondary structures were now all confirmed to be part of a connected environmental cluster spanning multiple decades of use. But what troubled investigators most was not the architecture itself, but the consistency of documentation found across all sites. The same phrasing patterns, the same structural terminology, the same references to storms as operational windows. One recovered log entry, dated years before Emily Grayson's death, stood out during final review. Cycle stability achieved. Subject no longer resists exposure conditions. Observer feedback loop confirmed. Prepare next iteration. The word iteration changed the tone of the entire investigation, because it implied repetition. And repetition implied continuity beyond individual cases. Bennett requested a full historical comparison between all confirmed incidents now linked to the system structure. The results were delivered within hours. Across 3 decades of data, analysts identified what they described as behavioral recurrence clusters. These were not identical events, but structurally similar sequences of observation, environmental triggering, subject movement, and disappearance. Each cluster followed a nearly identical progression pattern, despite occurring in different states, different years, and involving different individuals. Even more unsettling, some clusters appeared to overlap temporally, as if multiple sequences were running simultaneously. A federal systems engineer studying the model made a quiet observation during the briefing. "This doesn't behave like a linear system," he said. "It behaves like a parallel processing structure." Bennett turned toward him. "Explain." The engineer hesitated. "It suggests multiple cycles operating at once, each informed by prior outcomes." That sentence landed heavily in the room, because it reframed everything again. Not a single killer, not even a coordinated group acting in isolation, but a system that learned from itself, adapted, adjusted, and continued. Later that night, a final audio fragment recovered from the Oregon archive was played in the command center. Unlike previous recordings, this one contained no environmental noise. No distortion. Just a clear, steady voice speaking into what sounded like a controlled recording environment. Cycle 12 shows increased predictability during storm exposure. Subject selection accuracy improving. Observer confirmation remains stable. Internal node behavior requires further calibration. Then a pause, followed by a second line, quieter, almost reflective. Continue until resolution is no longer required. The recording ended. No identification. No context. Only instruction. Bennett sat in silence after it finished, the weight of decades pressing against a conclusion no one in the room wanted to articulate directly. Because if resolution was no longer required, then the system was not designed to end. It was designed to persist, to iterate, to refine. And somewhere inside that realization, Cedar Ridge stopped being the origin point of a crime and became something far more unsettling. A test environment that may have been operating long before Emily Grayson ever stepped into a gas station under storm-dark skies. And if the system had truly reached multiple cycles, then Mercer's death, the bunker collapse, the recovered journals, and every layer of investigation so far might not represent closure at all. Only transition to the next iteration. By the 11th and final phase of the investigation, the word closure had already been removed from every internal briefing document, not by order, but by necessity, because no one could agree on what it would even mean anymore in a case where every resolved layer immediately generated another, deeper layer beneath it, as if the structure they were uncovering was not built to be finished, but built to be continuously interpreted, continuously expanded, and continuously reactivated by the act of observation itself. The command center was quieter now, not because the work had slowed, but because language itself had begun to fail the people using it. Reports were shorter. Sentences were stripped down. Even experienced federal analysts stopped using speculative phrasing, because speculation always turned into confirmation within hours. Every hypothesis that once sounded extreme had a habit of returning later as validated data. Outside, the rain over Cedar Ridge had not stopped in days. It no longer felt like weather. It felt like a condition. Inside the final consolidated system map projected across the central screen, everything that had been uncovered over months of excavation, data reconstruction, and forensic reanalysis was now compressed into a single layered structure. Emily Grayson's disappearance, Rebecca Vance's abduction, Lisa Moreno's burial site, Mercer's movements, the Oregon archives, the bunker network, the satellite logs, the Sedan sightings, the RH designations, and the unexplained internal node classification all existed simultaneously within one operational framework. But at the very center of it, the undefined node remained. No name, no classification, no resolution, just a stable presence that refused categorization. A systems analyst finally spoke what everyone had been avoiding. If everything we've reconstructed is accurate, he said, then Mercer was never the origin of the violence. He was part of a cycle that was already active. No one disagreed, because disagreement required an alternative explanation. And there was none left that could survive the evidence. Bennett stood in front of the projection for a long time, watching the system respond to input data in real time. Every new piece of information did not collapse the model. It refined it, tightened it, reduced randomness, increased predictability. The system was behaving like something that had been trained over time using repeated behavioral cycles under controlled environmental conditions. He finally asked the question that had been sitting in the room for weeks, unspoken. So what happens when the cycle completes? Silence followed. Then a behavioral systems consultant answered carefully. If the pattern is consistent, she said, completion is not the objective. Continuation is. That single sentence reframed everything one last time. Continuation, not resolution, not termination. Continuation as function. The final breakthrough came from a cross-analysis of all recovered audio fragments, logs, and journal entries, where linguists identified a recurring structural pattern embedded in nearly every source of recovered communication. Regardless of origin, Mercer, Oregon logs, bunker entries, satellite fragments, the same conceptual framework appeared repeatedly in different phrasing: cycle, subject, observer, environmental trigger, internal node, iteration. The structure was not descriptive. It was procedural, a sequence, not of events, but of roles. Bennett requested one final synthesis of all data into a single behavioral timeline. When the model rendered, it did not display a beginning. It did not display an origin point. Instead, it showed a looping structure, each cycle feeding into the next, slightly modified, slightly refined, as if the system was learning from itself without ever requiring external input. At the bottom of the visualization, a timestamp field appeared. Cycle status, active. Iteration count, unknown. That was the moment the realization fully settled, not as theory, not as interpretation, but as structural implication. There had never been a case in the traditional sense. There had only been cycles of observation, behavior, and environmental alignment repeating across time, producing outcomes that were then recorded, analyzed, and fed back into the system itself. And somewhere within that system, Mercer had not been the creator. He had been one iteration, a participant, a subject, possibly even an observer at a different level of the same structure, but not the source. As the team prepared the final report, a final recovered fragment from the earliest archive was played one last time. It was older than the bunker recordings, older than the Oregon logs, possibly predating Mercer entirely. The audio was faint, almost degraded beyond recognition, but one line came through clearly enough to silence the entire room. Do not wait for the system to end. It does not end. It adjusts. No one spoke after it finished. Outside, the rain continued falling over Cedar Ridge, unchanged, unbroken, as if responding to no one at all. Bennett turned off the projection screen. For the first time in months, there was nothing left to analyze in front of him. But that did not feel like closure. It felt like confirmation that the analysis itself was part of the structure. As the lights dimmed in the command center, the final case file was marked in the system. Not closed. Active pattern detected. And continuing. And somewhere, far beyond Cedar Ridge, beyond the excavation lights, beyond the archived evidence and reconstructed timelines, the same question that had guided the investigation from the beginning remained unanswered, not because it had been ignored, but because it had never been the correct question at all. Not who committed the crimes, not even how they were committed, but whether anyone had ever truly been outside the system long enough to see where it began, or whether every observer had always already been inside it, watching and being watched.